like I'm continually up here. So this has been, and since you're probably likely not going to see me anymore, I just want to take an opportunity to thank Wesley and thank Kieran and as well as Darren, who unfortunately had to leave a little bit early, for inviting me, and also I think for putting on a really fantastic 2 days of workshop. And I was invited to come and present, and also at some levels to also represent the International Press Institute. But I've learned a lot from sitting here and listening and following and asking questions. So and not just from the speakers, but just from everybody in the room. So thank you very much for that. One of the things that I was asked to do is to look at the whole international aspect of self-regulation. The Caribbean faces a big question of how best to self-regulate the media. And I have some examples from around the world. Some of them would look a little bit familiar because I know Wesley mentioned some of them, but in some cases I want to go a little bit deeper. And I believe in some of these examples there might be some lessons here for the Caribbean as you look at how you're going to approach this issue of self-regulation. I also wanted to mention a few words about ombudsman. I haven't heard that mentioned here, but I know some newspapers in the region, and we're seeing an increasing number of publications around the world are beginning to hire ombudsmen, which in some cases have helped as sort of a stopgap measure between on the road to full self-regulation, because it gives the public an opportunity, an outlet to talk back, if you will, in an effective way to the newspapers, and I'll have some examples of that to come. In fact, I'm also a bit partial to being to ombudsman, because I was at one point a newspaper ombudsman at my college newspaper. I was in the United States, the very first, I'm not sure if there have been any since, student ombudsman for a student paper. And in fact, I got some requests from Japan, of all places, where apparently this is very, very, very hot, being ombudsman, to talk about what that experience was like. In fact, the student publication, in many cases, took it as hard as some of the professional publications in terms of having to correct errors and the young journalists having to explain the decisions that they made in coverage. So that was for me a very, very interesting and informative experience as I was starting my life in journalism. Now, as I mentioned, the role of the ombudsman, we're seeing it growing in Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia. And this is according to the Organization of News Ombudsmen. And even in North America, we've seen some newspapers gaining, even as we see the numbers of journalists going south. We see ombudsman numbers in some cases increasing or going north. While creating the ombudsman position is one way, as I mentioned, to begin to tackle the whole issue of media self-regulation, it is no substitute for it. There are deeper models being enacted, or in some cases being rejected, in countries around the world, and I think we should sort of. I'm going to discuss some of them. The first one I want to talk about is Britain, and as I mentioned, Wesley talked about that, but I want to sort of go into that in a little bit more detail. So, after news of the world phone hacking scandal, the Leveson Commission recommended a series of measures to improve press accountability. Before we get into the debate and the recommendation, listen to what Stephen Barnett of the University of Westminster has to say about self-regulation in the UK. Quote, "Let's be clear that the problem is not just phone hacking. It's not just the news of the world, and it's not just about law breaking," he says. "It has become increasingly clear over the last few months that we are talking about a culture of, at best, thoughtless and at worst, malicious, immoral, and corrupt practices in several of Britain's national newspapers, newsrooms, primarily but not exclusively confined to the tabloid press. Self-regulation," he says, "has consistently failed. The last one was set up in 1990 following a series of equally flagrant breaches of ethical standards during the late 1980s. The result was a new self-regulator, the Press Complaints Commission. It has proved itself to be toothless and incapable of standing up for ethical journalism. Its funding is not transparent. It is in hoc to the big publishers, and it acts simply as a conduit between individual complainants and publishers who are determined not to acknowledge their mistakes," unquote. In presenting, more than likely, Levinson would agree with that summation. And in presenting his report, he said it was clear that the current Press Complaints Commission, comprised of newspaper editors and limited in its powers, was not working. Instead, he called for an independent body free of influence from both the government and news media groups to be enshrined in the law. The powerful new body would investigate and arbitrate claims made by victims of media wrongdoing and issue fines of as much as $1.6 million. The ball moves back into the politicians' court, he said after presenting his report. They must now decide who guards the guardians. The panel's non-binding recommendations put immediate pressure on Prime Minister Cameron. The release of the report immediately divided the British political establishment, with the Prime Minister saying he has serious concerns about and misgivings about the media watchdog underpinned by law, as Levinson had recommended. There was, of course, no division among the media. Almost universally, all of the newspaper publishers were pretty much unanimous in being against the recommendations. And it didn't take long for the Prime Minister to conclude that he had heard enough. He really wasn't that crazy about approving or going along with the recommendation. So what he did, I guess as any man would do, he passed it on to the Queen, and he says, let's deal with having a royal charter, which Wesley talked about, to create a press regulator. And free press organizations, including the International Press Institute, objected to the whole idea of having a press regulator. In fact, many of us said, in a statement that was sent to London, it would have a chilling effect, and it would be used to muzzle the media. But having said that, it was approved. It became law as a royal charter. But Barnett, who I quoted earlier from the University of Westminster, the professor, he makes a few recommendations that I think, as part of this whole debate, that I think it would be important for Caribbean journalists to listen to, particularly as you try to formulate how a self-regulation is going to work here in the Caribbean. He says the system must have, if you're going to do a self-regulatory system, it must have the power to initiate thorough investigations into allegations of malpractice, including misreporting, or misrepresentation of groups, as well as individuals, for example, asylum seekers or Muslims. Effective and proportionate sanctions for journalistic malpractice, including the right to prompt corrections with equal prominence. The power to impose punitive fines where breaches of an agreed journalistic code are deliberate and/or reckless. An independent ombudsman or appeals tribunal, a means to accommodate in confidence the complaints of individual journalists about unethical practices in their workplace, for example, a whistleblower's charter. He also said it should have severe financial penalties, for example, in addition of that, for those publications that refuse to participate in the new system. There may also be a case for compelling membership in the case of publications with very large circulations or online readerships. 7, he said, an individual standards executive with seniority at board level to be nominated by each publication with an obligation to monitor newsroom behavior, to act as a conduit for informal editorial advice, and to be accountable to the ombudsman or tribunal in responding to investigations or complaints. 8, he said it should have audit requirements, a clear record of advice sought and obtained from the nominated standards advisor for any journalistic investigation that might involve a code or breach. I think those are really important points to consider as we decide here in the Caribbean exactly how we're going to set up a self-regulatory system. Now, let's look at Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, there is the Press Council, a quasi-judicial body that was established under the Press Council Act of 1974 with a view to preserve the freedom of the press and to maintain and improve the standard of newspapers and news agencies in the country. In general, it has been seen that most aggrieved people do not like to file legal petitions against newspapers, and often they are reluctant to go to the Press Council because of lengthy procedures involved in getting remedies, although they feel that they are deprived of exercising their rights. One newspaper, the Amada Shamoy, created the position of press ombudsperson. They wanted to stay away from calling it press ombudsman because they didn't want to, as they put it, offend anybody. So the office of ombudsperson at Amada Shamoy was created as a buffer between the press and the people. The establishment of the office for the media really, according to them, the establishment came because the media realized the need for an independent authority to safeguard the freedom of the press and protect individuals and institutions from excesses by journalists. These are the functions of the ombudsperson: to facilitate the newspaper to maintain freedom of expression guaranteed in the Constitution, to provide the public with fair, free, and quick method of resolving any complaints they may have pertaining to newspapers, to develop a professional code of ethics for journalists, and to activate the Office of Press Ombudsperson to provide remedies for the aggrieved. One of the things that's been reported in Bangladesh is that since that position was created, they have seen a lot more of a reduction, interestingly enough, in complaints about excesses of the media, but they've had studies that have shown that the people feel, interestingly enough, even better about the media since the position was created. Now let's look at what's being done in Denmark. To hear a lot about newspapers, we often hear a lot about newspapers in terms of self-regulation and ombudsman. Here's how a network in Denmark dealt with the issue. Most of the public service broadcasters have a bad tradition when it comes to corrections and clarifications. At Denmark newspapers, it's fairly easy to get a correction printed. But on television and radio, the attitude is often a very different one. It's really difficult to have a correction read on nightly news in Denmark. And for those of you watching, participating, and working in television here in Trinidad, the situation is probably similar, because certainly in Miami, we seldom see a correction on the evening newscasts, even though we know that many have been made. The producers would come up with myriad arguments why they, and it's in Denmark, why they cannot make a correction on the evening newscast. They would say that it can confuse the readers or the viewers. Maybe many of them haven't even seen the mistake in the first place, and it can be difficult to put the correction into the relevant context if it's a complicated story. Almost 10 years ago, DR, which is the Danish Broadcasting Corporation, created the position of listener and viewer editor. The position was established after a major Danish media scandal. As part of the scandal, there was a claim in several newspapers about a documentary produced by DR. One sequence was heavily manipulated, and the management slowly realized that there could be no excuse for such manipulation. Although the Director General apologized, the case never really went away. Part of the outcome of this discussion and confidence building was a decision to introduce a new position as the listener and viewer editor. The daily management was against the idea, but the Board of Governors insisted. There were lots of skeptics in the early years, and as I mentioned, many of them were from inside the company itself. Since then, an appeal system was created and is now up and running, and new ethical guidelines were developed. When Parliament redid the radio and TV law a few years ago, it mentioned the position of listener and viewer editor, which was a huge, huge victory for those who've been trying to get that position regularized and become part of the system there at the network. The position now reports to the Board of Governors, which gives the person doing the job a lot more independence. Now let's look for a bit at Australia, and again, another country that Wesley mentioned, but I want to look a little bit more deeply at what happened in Australia. In the midst of the British phone hacking scandal, the Australian government decided to look into self-regulation mechanism involving the Australian media. Former federal court judge Ray Finkelstein was appointed in late 2011 to preside over the government inquiry into media regulation. Finkelstein told Parliament that even with no evidence of wrongdoing, media regulation was necessary. Australia already had two instruments regulating the media. One is the Australian Communications and Media Authority, which is for the broadcast media, and the Australian Press Council, which is a self-regulatory body for the print media. The APC was also established after the federal government began preparation of legislation to create a government authority to ensure accountability in 1975. The council is funded by the newspaper and magazine industries. It relies on publishers and editors to respect the council's views, to adhere voluntarily to ethical standards, and to publicly admit mistakes. Finkelstein said this, and I suspect this is an argument you're going to hear in the Caribbean quite a bit. Newspaper owners, he says, quote, wield enormous power, and it struck me as being very odd that any group in society that wields enormous power should not be wholly or substantially regulated, unquote. He he said self-regulation had failed in Australia. In his report, Finkelstein recommended that print and online news should come under direct federal government oversight with the creation of a statutory regulator with the power to prosecute media companies in court. The new body would encompass all platforms of media and be called the News Media Council. Failing that, he recommended an increase in funding and powers of the Australian Press Council. The recommendation initiated debate on both sides, and the government coalition released an eagerly anticipated package of reforms. Those reforms included posing a public interest test for nationally significant media mergers and acquisitions, the introduction of a public interest test into the Broadcasting Services Act, the appointment of a public interest media advocate with powers to approve mergers or acquisitions and to declare independent self-regulatory bodies to oversee news media standards and complaints. Limited the number of commercial television broadcasting licenses, added new Australian content quotas, for commercial television broadcasters. And finally, it proposed to make permanent the 50% license fee rebate for commercial television broadcasters. Debate over the bill was so fierce that it threatened to collapse the coalition government. In the end, the government, despite personal lobbying by then Prime Minister Julia Gillard, had to withdraw the plan. In conclusion, it's clear that the media have to be involved, indeed, in some cases, drive the train in any attempt at self-regulation. Governments have a role to play, of course, but it's not in formulating the regulation unilaterally by which the media are to be governed. Again, the government should not be doing this on its own without significant input on the part of the media. Maybe one of the best indications of this is the Declaration of Principles of Freedom of Expression by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. It states in paragraph 9, effective self-regulation is the best system for promoting high standards in the media. And it's clear that this self-regulation should largely be undertaken by the people who are going to be regulated. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, many of you in the room, and the media of the world. Thank you very much.